It sounds like things are getting worse, not better for the Russians in Belgorod. But I thought the Russian military was going to protect them. According to some leaked interceptions, things are getting weird. This is from Insight in Ukraine and Russia. Let's get into it. Okay, be sure to support our guy's channel. I always link in the description. He makes great content, and I only look at a small fraction of the intercepts that he drops every week.
So you're going to hear an intercepted phone call from Belgorod region in Russia. And also I'll show you something else. But let's start with the interception first.
Здорово, сэр. Разбудил. С этой войной заснешь, понял. Ну, тихо. Сереж, больше я поклялся перед пацаном, перед одним, своими детьми, понял. Больше я никуда не выйду, я клянусь. Я не хочу. Все, хорош.
Yeah, this is one of the things, guys, that is really one of the fundamental problems of a conscript army. Now, in times of national crisis, right, you need to get manpower, right? And the tried and true way to do it, at least since like around the Napoleonic era, but there's some history of conscription as far back as ancient Greece, is to find able-bodied men, pull them from their duties, and put them into military service. Now, things are hard, right? And because even as the Greeks found that when they would conscript young men to fight, it meant that those young men weren't working in agriculture, one of the most important industries. So fighting would be timed around the planting and harvest season. Now, in the modern era, right, this has shown up in a bunch of different weird ways. For example, employees of key industries in Russia are exempt from mobilization, key defense industries. In the Second World War, right, farmers, a lot of agricultural workers were exempt from the draft. So you see these things and you realize that, you know, mobilization comes with a bunch of these prices. But for a lot of citizens, right, being drafted, leaving your family, leaving your kids behind, where you might have a huge change in your income, a huge drop in all likelihood in your income. These are really bad outcomes. So bad, in fact, that in the Vietnam War, the U.S. just wouldn't draft you if you had a kid. So all of a sudden, fatherhood looked real good to a lot of young men who might not have been able to get into college.
Ну, это ж пишут. Никто. Вот в этот раз я никуда не уезжал, понял. Люди поехали там. Не, Сереж, раз отвечаю, я отъезжал, и то... А ну, полностью, да, тишина. Так и, Серый, я же заехать не смог. На красе они пускают. У меня собака, немец, овчарка. Мне его надо ехать кормить, понимаешь?
I'm not sure what this is a reference to. He's almost making it sound like he's in hiding. They don't allow me to enter Krasno. I have a dog. I have to go feed him. So he has to go into this town that he's not allowed in. It's either, no, what I think it is, I think he's part of the contingent of civilians who were evacuated from Belgorod when Ukrainian forces began to operate in the region. And since Ukrainian forces have continued to operate in the region, Russian civilians likely are not allowed to return. This is a common counterinsurgency tactic. Usually it's seen as being much more draconian, in which civilians are forcibly removed from a region and all individuals found in that region are treated as hostile. The U.S. would call it sometimes the strategic Hamlet program. The French in Algeria did something similar where they basically cleared out the countryside and then would have aircraft overfly the countryside with orders that anyone operating there could be shot, right? So I imagine that a lot of insurgent shepherds were taken out because, again, if you know anything about North Africa, you know that you can't be a shepherd in a city. But yeah, these programs are generally, in almost every analysis, expected or regarded by most analysts as having failed. What they did when you moved out civilians, all you did was move the insurgent networks into wherever you put the civilians. And usually the ability to detect and destroy small groups operating in mountains or in woods was just not that great. It just wasn't that effective at targeting. Because you have so many people like this, right? Look at, you remember that illness that was going around the country where people were like, okay, don't go out, like wear a mask, like do these key things. And look at just how many people either chose not to listen, didn't take it seriously, or tried, but like literally had real life happen to them. You know, this is a great example. So if you sit there and go, don't go to this place, you will get shot. A lot of people go, they're not serious. They're just making it up. I don't care. A lot of people look and say, you know, oh, I'm going to risk my life to feed my dog, or, you know, my family's lived in this house for generations. I'm not going anywhere. You know, again, I'm a shepherd and I have to take my flock out. Whatever it is, people have regular lives and they're complicated and they try to do what's best for themselves. And it may not look like the best decision. So it sounds like that's what this guy is, right? Forced out of his town, but he has a dog. He's like, I got to go feed my dog, so I'm going to go into this town.
Я его люблю. Заехать не могу. Я все равно заехал. Урод. Стоит какой-то, понял, патриот без номеров, перегорожено все на кроссе, я понял. Говорит, у меня приказ области, говорит, никого не пускать. Я говорю, у меня дети дома, говорю, в смысле никого не пускать? Я говорю, еду домой. Он говорит, мне, говорит, там лычек нету, понял, чи сержантчик какая-то. Разговаривай проще, я говорю, тебя далеко не придурок. Окно закрыл, направо накрасил.
Okay. This is pretty funny that this guy literally is like, oh, I saw this guy who was telling me I couldn't come in, but I knew he was a lower enlisted soldier because he didn't have shoulder boards. And he's like, I just rolled up the window and drove right past him. That's some brilliant stuff. This guy probably is worried about getting drafted. He's almost certainly former service, because if you've served and you can look at someone's rank and know right away how much you should respect what they have to say, like that's a sign.
Свернул и поехал, понял. Через Ломно я заехал. Но если ты знаешь эти пути, ты в курсе дела. Мне через Ракитное люди говорят, какое Ракитное? Я через Ломно я спустился, Антоновка объехал, Д-Куч и домой. Все. Конечно. Ну на легковой там не поедешь в машине.
Here on the map you can see locations that guy was talking about in the interception. As you can see, they're far from Shebekina in Belgorod, so there is a chance that something is going on there again. But it's weird that I haven't heard any news from there. So it's not clear yet why Russian soldiers don't allow civilians to go there. We'll see. Anyway, now I want to show you.
So it may be, as discussed, right? It may be Ukrainian aligned forces operating in the region. It may simply be, I think in all likelihood, Russia instituting a policy of emptying out the border regions to make it easier to patrol for insurgent raids. But it's also possible that Russia is preparing to counterattack or launch its own raids into Ukrainian territory from the area, which would itself be sort of interesting.
A very important video. It's a video with Strelkov Girkin, a Russian militarist, the guy who started a war in Donbass in 2014 and who recently was detained in Russia for criticizing Putin too much. That video that I'm going to show you is very interesting because he actually predicted his imprisonment 9 months ago. So let's watch it together.
Недавно я вывел в такую формулу. Говорят о борьбе так называемой патриотической, так называемой либерально-олигархической группировок в окружении Путина, что они борются между собой. Вот я для себя вывел такую ситуацию. Если завтра, условно говоря, меня под белые рученьки за разглашение каких-то сверхсекретных тайн, которых я не знаю, отправят в места заключения, это значит, что победила либерально-олигархическая группировка в окружении Путина.
Interesting. So this is a really interesting, he's arguing that there is basically, it's a very familiar trope that there's a deep state war, two factions within the Kremlin vying for control. One is the liberal oligarchic, which he's probably using as a euphemism for what I sometimes call Western facing or cosmopolitan oligarchs. These are people who think it would be most profitable for them and increase their power the most for Russia to become more open with the West, to engage in more trade, more movement of goods and services back and forth. This would be like, for example, someone who controls a Russian oil interest, right? Being able to sell more Russian oil is favorable to them. In contrast, there's the ultra-nationalist wing. These are usually people who stand to benefit from a more isolated, more militaristic Russia, defense contractors, people like Prigozhin. If there's one thing we can know about Russian oligarchs, and frankly, oligarchs in any country, like, don't kid yourself, they talk their book. And by that term, talking your book, means you promote as an ideology the things that are most profitable to you.
Путина. Если завтра, наоборот, меня призывают хотя бы в ограниченном виде на военную службу, или хотя бы в ЧВК, или куда-либо еще, там способов достаточно много, это значит, что победу одерживает, по крайней мере, патриотическая группировка. Условно, не условно, тем не менее. То есть та группировка, которая стоит за победу на Украине. А вот пока я болтаюсь промеж вот этих двух замечательных вариантов, это значит, что, как обычно, ни туда, ни сюда. Ждем, наблюдаем, смотрим.
I mean, this is interesting to hear anyone make someone who's a war criminal like Gherkin roll this sort of idea out that he sits in the middle between this liberal, what he calls the liberal oligarchic wing, and he calls it the patriotic wing. I've been calling it the ultra-nationalist wing. That wants to see a victory in Ukraine achieved for Russia at all costs, right? Willing to fully mobilize the state, probably use weapons that heretofore Russia has not. But his assessment that this is an internal Kremlin struggle is really interesting. And it's really interesting because he acts like there's debate over who won. It sounds like the ultra-nationalists made their play as through the Prigozhin coup attempt. But ultimately, when the chips were down, a lot of them didn't show up, so to speak. And the irony is, I think they miscalculated. I think they believed that by showing up, it would make them more likely to save their careers or maintain their positions of power. But the reality that seems to have occurred is that the other faction that, the Shoigu faction, they have purged anyone with any association with Wagner or the PMC. So the irony is that people who were even marginally associated with the Prigozhin ultra-nationalist PMC wing should have immediately backed him instantly and not tried to sort of curry the good graces of the state, knowing that the state was going to be completely purging anyone with even a shred of association.
Смотрим. Смотрите на меня, условно говоря. Из этого делайте выводы. Посадят, значит, забывайте про победу в этой войне. Не посадят, отправят служить, значит, надежда на победу есть. Может быть, я слишком, конечно, пафосен и слишком высоко оцениваю свою роль, но и то, и другое действие являются логичными со стороны власти. А то, что ситуация, в которой я сейчас нахожусь, это нелогично. Просто нелогично. Ни в коей степени. Рано или поздно логика восторжествует, вопреки всему. Какая? Посмотрим.
So, according to Gherkin's prediction, Russia is going to lose because it's not ready to listen to its radicals and the so-called patriots, to people who want Russia to prevail in Ukraine. Hopefully, Gherkin was right, and we'll see.
Yeah, I think, again, I would argue that in some ways, Gherkin's right. Like, his strategy would probably work, right? If Russia was willing to go beyond the pale of that it's currently maintained, right? If it was to fully mobilize all of its people, if it was to mobilize every single person, like a World War II style mobilization, and if it were coupled with their willingness to use things like chemical weapons, possibly tactical nuclear weapons, right? Like, they could win this war. The consequences for the Russian state would be dire. Countries that have sort of been on the fence, the sanctions regimes that have existed, likely those would be heavily altered to Russia's against Russia. It would be something I suspect if you were to really see that action, like chemical weapons and nuclear weapons. I suspect that the answer would be that Russia would probably have something like all imports of any kind banned, so that Russia would be stuck trying to, grow it. Most of its time and effort would be spent trying to grow its own food and provide a rudimentary level of medical care. That's what I sort of suspect would happen. So again, I think the international community would agree, because almost every country has some sort of disputed areas, some sort of dispute with a neighbor. And what you don't want to do is normalize the ultra-nationalist Russian solution to these problems, which is extreme interstate violence. That's the route to, a World War III and total anarchy. So anyway, guys, thank you so much for joining me as always. Thanks a ton to the members of combatvetnews.com. Of course, if you want access to those uncensored combat videos, I do all that analysis on Combat Vet News. And of course, a special thank you to our Colonel tier members and our Lieutenant tier members. You guys are the ones who make this whole thing possible. Thank you so much. And I will catch you guys in the next one.